There is a moment in every great collapse when reality quietly replaces belief. Not with panic, not with riots, not even with violence at first, but with numbers. Cold, unemotional numbers. And once those numbers no longer add up, no speech, no election, no policy, and no promise can stop what comes next. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember this. Civilizations do not fall because people lose faith. They fall because mathematics catches up. And that moment has arrived before, again and again, across 2,000 years of history. It is happening again, right now. Before you instinctively reject that idea, pause. Notice what just happened in your mind. A subtle resistance, a quiet thought that says, "This time is different." That thought has appeared at the beginning of every collapse in recorded history. It appeared in ancient Rome. It appeared in medieval Europe. It appeared in revolutionary France. It appeared in Weimar Germany. It appeared after World War II, right before the system was forcibly reset. And every time, the people who dismissed the pattern paid the highest price. Let's establish something clearly, from the very beginning. This is not a political argument. It is not a prediction. It is not fear-mongering. It is pattern recognition. History does not repeat because humans are evil. It repeats because incentives remain unchanged. And debt, once it exceeds the productive capacity of an economy, becomes a mathematical impossibility, not a moral one. Right now, global debt exceeds 330% of world GDP. That means the world owes more than 3 times what it produces in a year. The United States alone carries over $36 trillion in federal debt, before even accounting for unfunded liabilities like Social Security and Medicare. Student loans exceed $1.7 trillion. Auto loans exceed $1.6 trillion. Credit card debt is over $1.2 trillion. Corporate debt exceeds $11 trillion. These numbers are not controversial. They are public, they are measurable, and they are mathematically unpayable. But here is where things become uncomfortable. Every civilization that reached this level of debt faced the same choice. Not politically, mathematically. Either the debt disappears or the system does. There has never been a fourth option. Across 2,000 years of history, debt has been erased in only 3 ways. Through inflation, where money is printed until the currency collapses and debts are repaid with something nearly worthless. Through formal debt cancellation, where governments restructure or forgive obligations because payment is impossible. Or through war and catastrophe, where enough destruction occurs that debts simply become irrelevant. Different centuries, different technologies, different cultures, same outcome every single time. To understand why this happens, you must first understand what debt actually is. Debt is not money. Debt is a claim on the future. When you borrow $100,000, you are not borrowing cash. You are borrowing future productivity. You are promising that your future work will generate enough value to repay that amount plus interest. Now scale that logic to a nation. When the U.S. government borrows trillions of dollars, it is promising that future Americans, people not yet born, will produce enough value to repay that obligation. That promise works until it doesn't. The moment interest payments grow faster than economic output, the system enters a debt trap. At that point, new debt is no longer used to create growth. It is used to service old debt. That is the precise moment a financial system becomes structurally insolvent. Not morally wrong, not poorly managed. Simply impossible. Let's look at the math. If the global economy produces roughly $90 trillion a year and grows at 3%, that creates $2.7 trillion in new output. But if total global debt is over $300 trillion, even a modest 3% interest rate requires $9 trillion in annual interest payments. The economy creates $2.7 trillion. The debt demands $9 trillion. That gap cannot be closed. No innovation can fix it. No policy can negotiate with it. No optimism can overcome it. This is not ideology. This is arithmetic. History shows that debt collapses follow a predictable 6-stage pattern. Every time, without exception, the first stage is always the same. Stage 1. The expansion of credit. Easy money creates the illusion of prosperity. Credit expands. Borrowing feels productive. Growth accelerates. People feel wealthier. Not because they are producing more, but because they are spending future income today. This stage feels good. It always does. In ancient Rome, during the early empire, credit exploded. Patricians lent to merchants. Merchants lent to farmers. The Senate financed public works through loans. Aqueducts, roads, festivals, gladiator games. Rome appeared unstoppable, but very little of that spending increased productive capacity. It created spectacle, not sustainability. In medieval Europe, Italian banking houses lent to kings, nobles, merchants, and even the church. England financed the 100 Years' War with borrowed money. France lived beyond its means. Cathedrals rose. Trade expanded. Universities were founded. Debt disguised itself as progress. In the United States, the modern version began in the late 20th century. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, corporate leverage, cheap interest rates. From the 1980s to 2008, debt-fueled growth felt permanent. Home prices rose, markets climbed, consumption surged. It looked like prosperity. It was leverage. Stage 1 always ends the same way, with too much debt. Stage 2. Debt exceeds a critical threshold. Economists have observed that when total debt exceeds roughly 250% of GDP, growth begins to slow. Resources shift from investment to interest payments. The economy works harder, but produces less. This is where momentum turns. Rome reached this point by the early 1st century. By the reign of Tiberius, private debt had become universal. Even elite families were technically insolvent. They borrowed to maintain appearances, not to create value. Medieval Europe reached it by the 1340s. Kings owed more than their entire annual revenues. Banks were exposed beyond their capital. The system was fragile, but still standing. France reached it before the Revolution. By the 1780s, interest payments consumed over half of government revenue. The state existed to service debt. Nothing else. The United States crossed this threshold after 2008. Instead of deleveraging, the response was more debt. Quantitative easing. Zero interest rates. Stimulus upon stimulus. By 2020, global debt exceeded 320% of GDP. We didn't step back. We accelerated. There is a moment in every debt cycle when the language changes. At first, debt is described as a tool. Then it becomes a necessity. Eventually, it is treated as destiny. This is where most societies lose the ability to think clearly. Because once debt is normalized, questioning it feels irresponsible. In the early stages of debt expansion, borrowing is framed as investment, infrastructure, education, innovation. The narrative is optimistic. Debt is temporary. Growth is permanent. But this narrative quietly breaks the moment debt stops creating growth. And history shows that moment arrives sooner than anyone expects. Stage 3. Debt becomes self-perpetuating. This is the critical turning point. At this stage, debt no longer exists to fund productivity. It exists to prevent collapse. New borrowing is required just to keep the system functioning at its current level. Interest payments are rolled into new debt. Old obligations are refinanced. Losses are hidden through accounting. Nothing explodes yet, but nothing heals either. This is where Rome began to unravel. By the 2nd century, Roman elites were drowning in private debt. Landowners borrowed against future harvests. Merchants borrowed to maintain trade routes. Even the state borrowed to fund the military. But expansion had stalled. No new provinces were generating surplus. Rome was living off its own past. To manage the pressure, emperors debased the currency. Silver content in the denarius was reduced again and again. At first, nobody noticed. Prices rose slowly. Confidence remained. But debasement is cumulative. By the 3rd century, Roman currency had lost over 90% of its silver content. Trust collapsed. Trade slowed. The empire never recovered. The same logic played out in medieval Europe. When sovereign debt exceeded the ability to tax, kings turned to currency manipulation. Coins were clipped. Weights were altered. Standards quietly shifted. Inflation followed, and with it, social unrest. The Black Death did not create Europe's collapse. It exposed a system already weakened by debt. Fast forward to France in the 18th century. By 1788, the French government spent more on interest than on public services. The state existed to service creditors. When tax resistance increased and lenders lost confidence, the system froze. No more borrowing, no more liquidity. Within a year, the monarchy collapsed. Not because people suddenly hated kings, but because the numbers stopped working. Now consider the United States. After the 2008 financial crisis, the response was unprecedented. Instead of allowing debt to contract, the system expanded it. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero. Trillions of dollars were created digitally. Banks were stabilized. Markets recovered. The collapse was delayed, but the debt was not resolved. This is where many people misunderstand history. They believe collapse happens suddenly. It does not. It unfolds gradually, then all at once. The years after 2008 felt calm, but the structure was fundamentally altered. Debt was no longer something to be repaid. It became something to be managed indefinitely. Stage 4. Financial repression. When debt cannot be repaid honestly, it must be managed quietly. This is where governments intervene indirectly. Interest rates are held below inflation. Savings lose purchasing power. Assets inflate. This transfers wealth from savers to debtors, from the public to the system. It feels subtle. It feels technical. But it is deliberate. The United States has been in financial repression for over a decade. If inflation runs at 4% and interest rates pay 2%, the real value of debt shrinks. But so does the real value of savings. This is not theft in the legal sense. It is erosion, and erosion is politically safer. Rome did the same. So did Britain after World War II. From 1945 to the early 1970s, British debt was reduced primarily through inflation and controlled interest rates. Savers paid the price. Debtors survived. The system reset quietly. The U.S. followed this path after World War II as well. Debt exceeded 120% of GDP in 1946. It was not repaid through austerity. It was inflated away. Strong growth helped, but inflation did most of the work. The difference today is scale. Global debt has never been this high, never. And growth is slowing. That combination has never ended gently. Stage 5. Social fracture. When debt becomes permanent, trust deteriorates. People sense imbalance even if they cannot articulate it. Work feels less rewarding. Assets feel unattainable. The future feels smaller. This is not psychological weakness. It is structural pressure. Rome saw widening inequality. Elites insulated themselves. The middle class disappeared. Small landowners lost property to creditors. This hollowed out the social core of the empire. France experienced the same. Nobility paid little tax. The burden fell on commoners. Anger grew, not because of ideology, because the system felt rigged. In the United States, similar patterns are emerging. Housing affordability collapses. Student debt delays family formation. Wages lag behind asset prices. People work more and own less. Trust erodes. At this stage, politics becomes extreme, not because people are irrational, but because moderate solutions no longer work. Every proposal feels insufficient. Every institution feels compromised. Polarization accelerates. Stage 6. The reset. This is the stage no one wants to discuss, because it looks different every time. Sometimes it is inflation. Sometimes it is default. Sometimes it is war. Sometimes it is all three, but it always achieves the same outcome. Debt disappears. And so does the old system. The Roman Empire fragmented. France reset through revolution and war. Germany reset after hyperinflation. The global system reset after World War II. In every case, wealth was destroyed. Power was redistributed, and a new order emerged. This does not mean collapse is imminent tomorrow. History does not operate on social media timelines, but it does mean trajectory matters more than intention. And the trajectory is clear. The uncomfortable truth is this. Modern economies are no longer solving debt. They are extending it, kicking it forward, hoping growth returns fast enough. But growth cannot outrun compounding forever. No system has ever succeeded in doing so. This brings us to the most important question of all. If collapse is a process, not an event, then how do intelligent individuals respond? Not with panic, not with denial, but with preparation, because while systems collapse, certain positions survive. They always have. When systems fracture, most people focus on what is collapsing: markets, currencies, institutions. But history shows that collapse is not universal. It is selective. While some positions are destroyed, others quietly become stronger. And this is the mistake most people make. They assume crisis is total. It never is. Every major economic collapse since 1929 followed a predictable pattern. First, leverage breaks. Then, paper wealth evaporates. Finally, trust reorganizes. But within that chaos, certain positions repeatedly survive. Not because of luck, because of structure. To understand which positions endure, you must stop thinking like an investor and start thinking like a system. Systems do not care about ideology. They care about function. What must continue operating regardless of conditions? Who controls what cannot be paused? Where does value still flow when confidence disappears? Those answers have remained remarkably consistent for nearly a century. Position 1. Control over necessity. Infrastructure. The first position that survives every crisis is control over necessities, not luxuries, not speculation. Necessities: food, energy, water, logistics, healthcare. These sectors do not disappear during collapse. They become more important. During the Great Depression, stock markets fell nearly 90%. Banks failed, savings vanished, speculation died. But food distribution did not stop. Energy consumption did not collapse. Railroads still ran. Utilities still operated. Companies tied to physical necessity did not thrive, but they endured. And endurance during collapse is power. In the 1970s inflation crisis, paper assets were destroyed. Stocks stagnated for a decade. Cash lost purchasing power. But energy companies surged. Oil producers, refiners, pipeline operators. Why? Because energy is not optional. Inflation does not eliminate demand. It transfers cost. During the 2008 financial crisis, real estate collapsed. Banks failed. But companies controlling logistics, healthcare, and basic consumption stabilized first. Walmart expanded. Costco grew. Utilities remained solvent. Why? Because when money tightens, spending narrows to essentials. COVID followed the same script. Travel collapsed. Hospitality collapsed. Entertainment collapsed. But supply chains, grocery distribution, energy, and digital infrastructure accelerated. Amazon did not survive COVID. It consolidated power through it. History shows that the most resilient positions are not exciting. They are boring. They do not depend on optimism. They depend on necessity. This is why infrastructure assets historically outperform during systemic stress. Not because they grow faster, but because they fail slower. And in collapse, survival is leverage. Position 2. Monetary flexibility and hard assets. The second position that survives every crisis is control over monetary flexibility. This includes assets that exist outside the financial system. Assets that cannot be printed. Assets that cannot be defaulted on by decree. Gold has served this role for over 5,000 years, not because it is magical, but because it is scarce, divisible, durable, and universally recognized. During every monetary reset, gold preserved purchasing power. During the Great Depression, while stocks collapsed, gold was revalued upward by the U.S. government. Those who held it saw wealth preserved. Those who held only paper claims did not. During the 1970s inflation, gold rose over 2,000%, not because of speculation, because currencies were being diluted. During the 2008 crisis, gold stabilized portfolios. During COVID, it surged again, each time not as growth, but as insurance. But gold is not the only hard asset. Land, productive real estate, energy reserves, strategic commodities. These assets anchor value when currency floats. They do not rely on trust. They rely on physical reality. This is why wealthy families hold hard assets across generations, not for yield, for continuity. Monetary flexibility also means liquidity. Those who enter crisis with optionality survive better than those fully leveraged. Debt removes flexibility. Liquidity creates it. Every collapse punishes leverage. Every reset rewards patience. This is not theory, it is historical pattern. Position 3. Systemic relevance. The third position is the least discussed and the most powerful. Systemic relevance, being essential to the functioning of the system itself. During every crisis, governments prioritize certain actors. Banks that are too big to fail. Industries deemed critical. Institutions embedded into daily operations. This is not favoritism. It is triage. In 2008, small banks failed. Large banks were rescued. Not because they were moral. Because their collapse would have broken the system. During COVID, small businesses were destroyed. Large platforms were supported. Liquidity flowed upward. Not because of conspiracy, because systems preserve themselves. Systemic relevance creates protection, not guarantees, but priority. This is why platform companies consolidate during crisis. This is why infrastructure providers gain leverage. This is why centralization accelerates. History is clear. Crisis does not democratize power. It concentrates it. Those closest to the core of the system are cushioned. Those at the edges absorb shock. This pattern is visible in every collapse. Why most people lose. Most people lose not because they are irresponsible, but because they are positioned incorrectly. They rely on wages alone. They hold savings in depreciating currency. They trust institutions without understanding incentives. Debt traps individuals the same way it traps nations. Leverage removes choice. Choice is survival. Collapse is brutal to those without flexibility, but it is clarifying. It reveals structure. The psychological trap. Here is the psychological mistake people make during crises. They assume danger means action. They panic trade. They chase narratives. They attempt to outsmart systems in motion. This usually accelerates loss. History shows that patience outperforms activity during collapse. Not inaction, but restraint. Those who survive best are not the most aggressive. They are the most disciplined. They avoid irreversible decisions. They preserve optionality. This brings us to the most important realization. Survival is not about predicting timing. It is about positioning before inevitability. No one knows exactly when resets occur, but history tells us they do. And that knowledge alone is power. There is a quiet moment that arrives after understanding. Not relief, not fear, but clarity. It is the moment when patterns stop feeling abstract and begin to feel personal. Because once you see how systems collapse, you can no longer pretend you are outside them. You're already inside. The mistake many intelligent people make is assuming that awareness leads naturally to action. It doesn't. Awareness first leads to discomfort, because it forces a painful realization. Most of what we were taught to expect from modern economies is no longer structurally possible. Endless growth, ever-rising living standards, debt that never demands repayment. These were not permanent features. They were temporary conditions. For nearly 80 years after World War II, Americans lived inside an anomaly. The United States emerged as the world's industrial core. Its currency became the global reserve. Its debt was trusted. Its growth outpaced its obligations. That period shaped expectations. It trained multiple generations to believe that expansion was normal. It wasn't. It was exceptional. Every debt-driven system eventually reaches a moment where it must choose between truth and continuity. Truth says, the promises cannot all be honored. Continuity says, delay the reckoning. Every system chooses continuity. Until it can't. This is not because leaders are incompetent. It is because the system itself is trapped. Raising interest rates too high collapses debtors. Lowering them too much destroys currency value. Cutting spending causes unrest. Printing money causes inflation. Every option carries cost. So systems choose delay, and delay compounds pressure. This is why collapse is not a decision. It is an outcome, the result of accumulated compromises. Understanding this reframes how intelligent people should think about the future, not in terms of predictions, but in terms of resilience. History does not reward those who guess timing correctly. It rewards those who position themselves correctly. Positioning is not panic. It is not extremism. It is not abandoning society or withdrawing into fear. It is simply aligning yourself with reality instead of narratives. Let's return to the three positions that survive every collapse. Necessity, monetary flexibility, systemic relevance. These are not investment tips. They are structural truths. Necessity survives because people cannot opt out of reality. You can delay consumption. You can cut luxury. You cannot eliminate food, energy, healthcare, and infrastructure. These sectors anchor value. They do not make you rich overnight. They keep you solvent when others are wiped out. Monetary flexibility survives because currency is a promise, and promises fail. Hard assets do not depend on belief. They depend on physics, land, and scarcity. Liquidity creates optionality. Optionality creates survival. Systemic relevance survives because systems preserve themselves. Not individuals, not fairness, not morality. Function. The closer you are to core functions, the more protection you receive. This is uncomfortable, but it is observable. The fourth unspoken position is psychological, emotional discipline. Most losses during collapse are not forced. They are chosen under stress. Panic selling, overreaction, chasing narratives. Those behaviors destroy more wealth than inflation or default ever could. The people who survive best are rarely the loudest. They do not announce preparation. They do not broadcast fear. They quietly reduce fragility. This brings us to a deeply American tension. Americans are taught to believe that optimism is a virtue, that confidence creates outcomes, that belief itself can bend reality. There is truth in that, within limits. But belief cannot overpower arithmetic. Optimism does not cancel compounding. Confidence does not erase structural imbalance. Mature optimism is not denial. It is adaptation. It says, I see the constraints, and I will move intelligently within them. That mindset built civilizations. It also preserved families across generations. The goal is not to escape the system. That is fantasy. The goal is to understand where the system is brittle and where it is resilient, to avoid irreversible mistakes, to preserve agency. This is why the most dangerous emotion during systemic stress is certainty. Certainty leads to leverage. Leverage leads to fragility. Fragility leads to forced decisions. Humility performs better than confidence in collapse. Flexibility outperforms conviction. No one watching this needs to fear tomorrow, but everyone should respect trajectory. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. History has already shown us how that resolves. The only variable is how prepared you are when it does. This video was not created to scare you. Fear paralyzes. Understanding liberates. Clarity steadies. If you feel calmer now than when you started, that means something important happened. You replaced noise with structure. You replaced headlines with patterns. You replaced fear with orientation. That is the entire purpose of this work. If you believe more people deserve this level of understanding, not slogans, not outrage, but context, there is a thoughtful way to support it. You can subscribe, not out of habit, but intention. You can leave a like, not as approval, but as a signal that depth still matters. You can share this video with one person, not many. Someone intelligent, someone curious, and someone you would actually want to discuss this with afterward. That kind of sharing builds real conversations. And if you choose to leave a comment, make it deliberate, a reflection, a question, a perspective shaped by thought. Those comments are not for the algorithm, they are for the author, and for the culture this channel is trying to build. History does not punish ignorance immediately. It punishes it eventually. Understanding is not control, but it is the only advantage that survives every reset. Thank you for taking this seriously.